Okay, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. Often I sort of write on the board, where we are in the class, but I think right now it's pretty straightforward because we're really sort of right on target with the course schedule as we initially designed it. I'm just going to finish up talking a little bit about Monopoly today. I've got the sign-in sheet moving its way around the room. So, and for those of you who are watching it on either the live Zoom or the attendance link, or through a YouTube video, just go ahead and report your attendance on the attendance link in Brightspace under coursework discussions. That way you get credit for the attendance for the class. Okay. One thing I do before I start, I wanted to mention one thing that was kind of a glitch technically that came up, and that was the video from last Wednesday. For whatever reason, it didn't make its way to YouTube, didn't save. And it could have been that, maybe it didn't get saved correctly. It didn't, I stopped. I don't think it's anything I did because I do it pretty much like 4 times a week. So, but for whatever reason, it's not there. I'm gonna have to look for it and see if I can find it. I saved everything on this computer here, so I've got to physically be here to do it. And I don't think I really recognize that until Thursday. By then there's a classroom already in here. So, so I'll get that available. Fortunately, there's no exam pending right away, but I realize that is something that you'll want to see. So hopefully we'll figure out what went wrong and we'll get it uploaded. Usually there's no difficulty at all in this particular area, but sometimes we do have issues. So this week we're going to cover the rest of chapter 9, dealing with Monopoly. And that's a bit of a fragment from last week. And I do want to talk a bit about some examples of true monopolies, because one of the things that we talked about before was the idea, one of the characteristics, and I'll sort of swivel over here. I probably have a remote so I can move the camera a little faster. I don't know who, I guess somebody more important than me maybe complained about this. So one of the characteristics was that it's the very last one. It was unusual in the global context that they're mostly local phenomena. And that's really what is going on with monopolies, is that it's pretty rare to have a sort of worldwide or even nationwide monopoly on certain outputs. Yes, there are some firms that are big firms that seem to have market power, but do have competition, and competition enough that it sort of seems like they're monopolies. There's certainly big firms, giant firms, lots of influence, lots of ability to get their way when it comes to political issues. And by the way, the economic profit, that is the profit which takes into account opportunity costs, is considered the norm in monopolies if you're able to achieve that monopoly state. That's not a guarantee. So I know that and I know your text got into this a little bit, this idea that there's this feeling that you're guaranteed to have profit if there's a monopoly. Well, the problem with that is you can have a monopoly in a product that nobody wants. So as a result, the demand is not there, or the people aren't willing to pay very much for, or that it costs a heck of a lot to produce. And so in order to recover your costs, you're going to charge a fairly high price, and that could drive off buyers, or a combination of all of those. And so if there's no guarantee whatsoever that a monopoly is guaranteed to form profits, but it is the norm. And because when they don't form profits, they tend to go away. And if they go away, then there's no industry, because the firm essentially is the industry. So the thing that we ought to know, though, is that they're kind of unusual. And when we say they're mostly local phenomena, what we're really talking about are some examples of probably firms you've seen before, particularly if you've lived in small towns or out of the way areas. And that is, maybe it's the only tire store in a town of 1,000 people. That tire store is probably a pretty good, got a pretty good business. I used to have a client when I was in commercial lending who had a tire store in a very small town. That was like 900 some people. Most everyone was related to each other. Everyone knew him, and they got their tires from him. There's only one Chevrolet. There's only one car dealership. It was a Chevy dealership. So everybody drove Chevys because the nearest dealership was 40 miles away, and they didn't want to. Well, some did. Some made the drive, but a lot did not. So those would be examples of monopolies, but very local in nature. And I know that the dealer that in this remote area, and by the way, I went to a lot of these remote areas and saw a lot of these. The dealer said, well, he goes, if I need to raise additional money, I'll just charge my customers more. And it's like, okay, well, I guess I sort of made a mental note not to shop for cars from him, but you get the idea that if pricing is the issue and that firms are price makers, then they can set whatever price that the market will bear to the extent that the market will bear it. And I think that's really the issue. I know sometimes the one of the justifications for monopolies, believe it or not, there are justifications, is that, well, they don't really always charge the price the market can bear, because sometimes they try to be realistic with their price. And by the way, I'm going to get to the two historical examples here, which I think are really important to talk about here. And that is the Standard Oil monopoly of the 1880s and 90s and 1900s, and the Microsoft monopoly, which we're all very much familiar with. These sound like two firms that couldn't be any more different, but in fact, they've got a lot of similarities in the way that they formed their monopolies, and so we'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, look, whatever you local veterinarian, if you're the only veterinarian, you've got a monopoly. You've got, if you're the only producer of something in an area, you've got a monopoly going on. And by the way, sports franchises tend to be monopolies in almost all cases, because in only the very, very largest cities do you have more than one of those competing within the same league. So New York has two baseball teams, but almost nobody else does. Chicago does, but these are very large cities. LA does, but that's it. I don't think there's any other city that has more than two of those. And so they form local monopolies for the most part when they exist. So as a result, they tend to be somewhat unusual. Okay, now we're going to talk about the case before we move on to talking about the next market structure. We're going to move on to talking about monopolistic competition, but I do want to get into this issue of these historical examples of these two firms, both of which were monopolies. And it's not just the economists and the econ profession determining they were monopolies. The government actually determined they were monopolies. In other words, the courts ultimately determined that they were monopolies. And so as a result, government action was taken. In the case of Standard Oil, pretty drastic action was taken. And we're going to get into, as we get into chapter 11, which we're going to, after this next chapter, we're going to come back to monopolies a bit, talking about what's called antitrust policy. Not so much antitrust law, although we will talk about a couple of laws. We're going to address it from the economic standpoint, not so much the legal standpoint. But antitrust laws were passed in order to deal particularly with a company like this, but it was not the only one. So what about Standard Oil and Microsoft? How does Standard Oil, how is it similar? How is it different? Well, their formation was about 100 years apart, so that's pretty much a big difference there. Standard Oil, actually, John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler, who were the founders of Standard Oil, were not even in the oil business at all when they first started. They were in the vegetable business. They made a fortune selling vegetables as food products to the Union Army during the Civil War, and that allowed them then to get into branch out into other businesses. And they just sort of stumbled on oil just as a fluke, because of the fact they were living in Cleveland. And we don't think of Cleveland, Northern Ohio, Pennsylvania today as being oil country. That was where the oil patch was in this country in the late 1800s. It really started in Pennsylvania. In fact, there's Quaker State Oil is, Quaker State is Pennsylvania. Pennzoil, I mean, these are old companies, but they're going back to the original days of oil having started in Western Pennsylvania. And so, and oil at the time wasn't even used for automobiles, because automobiles weren't around. They were using it, they were getting oil for kerosene. And kerosene was the hot new thing. It replaced candles. It was considered safer than candles, because candles can tip over and hot wax can set things on fire. And kerosene is not safe either necessarily, but it's a lot brighter. It's cheap. It's powerful in terms of long lasting and whatnot. So that's what they were getting at. In fact, when they first started refining oil, by the way, the process of refining oil is basically cooking it at very high temperatures, and then it separates into various component products. One of the very first products is gasoline. They didn't know what to do with gasoline. So they just poured it in the river, which obviously is an environmental disaster. But if you've ever been to Cleveland, well, that's welcome to Cleveland. I know when I was a kid, the river would occasionally catch on fire if somebody would throw a cigarette in the river. There's just so much oil still floating around in it. And so they didn't know what to do. They just simply dumped it. And obviously today we've got laws dealing with that. And although the oil industry probably is not the best actor when it comes to environmental protection, we certainly saw that with the Deepwater Horizon, where they were simply unable to deal with that. Just went on week after week. It was like that news story where there was the oil well that was gushing in the Gulf of Mexico. But nonetheless, we'll talk less about the environmental, more about the economics of this. So Standard Oil was basically how they achieved their business was basically this. I'll jump ahead a little bit. They got it by controlling distribution. That's really the key thing here. So what was this business? So if you look at the oil business altogether, I mean, it's a very broad, diverse, not particularly integrated business. I mean, there are businesses that we call integrated oils that have drilling, refining, distribution pipelines, distribution and gas stations, but there aren't very many of those today. BP maybe one, Chevron, Mobil, Shell to some extent, although Shell is mostly a foreign firm, so that a lot of their drilling, they buy a lot of the oil in the open market. So, but there aren't that many of those today. But basically, Standard said, look, we don't want to be in all parts of this business. We just want to be in refining because crude oil doesn't do any good at all unless you can refine it. So they decided to refine the oil, to control the refineries, and went around buying refineries and just started buying them up, even sometimes paying way much more than they were worth. But it was worth it to get them off the screen, get them off the table in order to simply control that market, knowing it was a growing market, knowing it was going to be big business, big money if they were able to succeed in doing that. So, and in some cases, a lot of millionaires were created by refiners who sold out to Standard Oil back in the 1880s, 1890s, and whatnot, when they had the chance. And it was a carrot and stick proposition, frankly. And as religiously pious as John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler both were, they were pretty ruthless in business and did some things which today are not legal and were even sort of borderline not legal in those days. And that was this: okay, we want to buy your refinery, and we're going to give you X amount of money, and you can either take shares in Standard Oil, or we'll give you cash, whichever you prefer. We would advise you to take shares. Some did and got very, very wealthy as a result of the fact that Standard Oil became a very enormously profitable company. Some took the cash, some refused. And if you refuse, here's the carrot, or here's the stick, I guess. Because the stick is, we're going to drive you out of business because we're not going to allow you to, you can refine all the oil you want. Even if you're pumping and drilling and doing all these things, you've got to get it to market somehow. We control the railroads, and so we'll see to it that you won't be able to ship your oil anywhere because you're in Pennsylvania. That's not where all the manufacturing is. Of kerosene, we need to get it to the East Coast. But we'll see that you can't get there. And if you do somehow ship it on the railroads, we'll demand from the railroads a rebate for every boxcar that you transport. So they'll basically overcharge you and compensate us with the difference, because that's the arrangement that we have with the railroads. Today, that sort of arrangement, I'm sure, is illegal. Also, they said, well, if you want to try to send it through pipelines, we control the pipelines. And so distribution was the way that really that monopoly was enforced. Only one link in the value chain, which seems like you would want to have the whole thing, but they found out what is the most important linchpin, and that's getting this dirty, crummy oil and being able to refine it, and then from there being able to control how it gets to the market, turning on the spigot, turning off the spigot, all those kinds of things. Kind of like a drug dealer, sort of turning it on, turning it off, if you want, in order to manipulate the price. And that's essentially what they did. Okay, so when we say this is a commoditized product, it's obviously way different. And I want to point out the fact that it's obviously far different than Microsoft's high-tech products. There's nothing particularly complicated about oil, really, at all. But it was a commoditized product, which makes it even more interesting in the sense that really what they were doing was sort of capitalizing on this brand new idea of capitalism and this brand new idea of how to take advantage of capitalism by creating monopolies. At the time, even though today these sort of nationwide monopolies are sort of rare, at the time there were lots and lots of monopolies. There were steel monopolies, with U.S. Steel. There were regional rail monopolies in certain parts of the country. You had one railroad if you're looking to transport goods or whatnot. So there are lots and lots and lots of monopolies, and the question is what to do about them. We'll talk about that in chapter 11, and we'll get to that. But one of the things is that Standard Oil at its peak had around 90% market share. So, and I know that this came up a lot during the Microsoft trial of the late 90s. And I had students who said at the time, well, how can Microsoft be a monopoly when there are competing products that, because remember what they were on trial for, and they didn't have to go to trial, but it got there, was operating systems, for computers, okay? Personal computers and servers and businesses and whatnot. And they had also about a 90% market share. And so people were saying, well, wait a minute, a monopoly is 100% of the market share. And that is not the case. It's all or substantially all. We say substantially all the market share. And by the way, there's a measure that we're going to be, I'll be introducing to you on probably Wednesday. We'll probably get to chapter 11 on Wednesday. We may not get to that particular measure. It's called the Herfindahl Index, which we measure market power in terms of market share. And 90% is good enough to really make it a monopoly. Even though, yes, there were competing operating systems like Linux systems, which are more customized to the particular user. And, Apple had its own operating system and whatnot. But nonetheless, Microsoft sort of dominated this market. Okay. And by the way, they achieved this monopoly also by controlling distribution. So I think this is really the key issue here, is for these monopoly formations by controlling distribution. How did Microsoft do it? They essentially pressured hardware makers. And we know this because the reason this thing got to a trial, it started out, the Federal Trade Commission, and we'll get to this more in Chapter 11, the Federal Trade Commission is part of the executive branch, but it doesn't really report to the president. It's mostly independent. And they are in charge of trying to make sure that monopoly formation doesn't get going. And if it does, they'll try to sort of pass a law to the Justice Department to sort of deal with it. The Justice Department tried for many years to try to work with Microsoft to get them to figure out something so as not to monopolize the market. Now, the problem is, and Bill Gates at the time said, look, I can't help it that we're a monopoly. I didn't have a desire to start out a monopoly. I can't help it that we're so awesome. And in fact, the courts have determined, this is something that I think a lot of us were not aware of at the time, that it was not illegal to become a monopoly, it was just illegal to maintain your monopoly. Maintaining the monopoly was the big problem there. And so the reason they got to trial was the fact that they could never come to an agreement with the Justice Department. And then Microsoft had so much money and so much wealth that they prolonged it. It spilled over out of the Clinton administration into the Bush administration, and finally got resolved years after the fact. And with really no clear victory for the government, I don't think, in this particular case. But I think time was on Microsoft's side, but also time was on the markets, the demand side as well, because other sorts of alternative means of technology exist, even though Microsoft Windows is still the dominant form that's being used today. So no clear victory for the government, unlike the case of Standard Oil, which the solution to Standard Oil was to simply break it up and to simply take the refineries in this part of the country, break them up, form a separate company, and so all these different companies were formed out of Standard Oil, many of which still exist today. Some of which, by the way, have gotten back together. Exxon was probably the biggest of those, and Mobil is another, and ExxonMobil have rejoined forces, and after having been split apart with the Standard Oil breakup in the early 20th century, they've rejoined forces again. Chevron, which was Standard Oil California, is in conjunction with Texaco now. So this idea of breaking up monopolies and breaking up market power and having them reform is sort of a pendulum swing back and forth. It really depends upon the government that's in power at the time as to whether or not they want to allow that to happen. And we're going to talk much more about that whole dynamic when we get into Chapter 11 and talk about what's known as antitrust policy and what it's all about. Okay, so this is essentially what's going on with these two. I think are really good historical examples of monopolies. And by the way, I mean, yes, we could get into something like the cotton monopoly and the leather monopoly and all that, but these are probably the two most prominent ones, mostly because of the fact that the government really went after them to try to break them up. And that's not that common of a thing, frankly. Yes, there are, you can look up, if you're familiar with how to look up case law, you can look at, General Electric, the government has gone after them from time to time. The European Union did not allow GE to buy Honeywell, two US-based companies, but the Europeans said no because it would create too much market power in Europe. And so that combination never took place over time. And we're going to talk about this idea of combining. We've seen all this happen over a very long time period, this idea of companies buying other companies. And the reasons for it are basically economies of scale, or one of the things that is this idea of moving down along your long run cost curve, because particularly you can duplicate efforts, you can duplicate the same sorts of activities, or what are duplicate, you can get rid of the duplicate, I should say, get rid of those duplicate activities. By the way, one final thing about this is Microsoft, the judge in the trial at one point decided to order a breakup of Microsoft. At the time, everyone was scratching their heads because it's how do you break up a software company? It's not really a physical thing. I mean, in the case of Standard Oil, it was broken up into some 30-some different companies because you could obviously see physically where a refinery is and where another refinery is. You could simply say, okay, those are separate companies. But software is not really a thing. It's more intellectual property. And how do you break it up? It seemed impossible. And that eventually did not stick. That was a sort of preliminary order. And I think that the judge, who was so frustrated in this, by this case because it went on forever and ever and ever, I think he just got exasperated. And I think he probably honestly was in over his head, frankly, with some of the arguments. I think that's sort of the judgment that I've heard from lawyers who are familiar with this, is the fact that Judge Jackson out of his death. And Microsoft just prolonged the whole matter. Okay, so we'll talk much more about antitrust, but those are two examples that we should talk about. Well, there are some other examples as well that I think are notable, and we should talk about. AT&T was one example over time, but here are some ones that are probably more understandable for a lot of us. And the Beers Group was diamond exporting and mining. So De Beers, this is probably one of the most controversial companies anywhere. It's a very old company. I believe it's a Dutch firm that's been involved in diamond mining and diamond extraction all the way through what we call the value chain, what we call vertical integration. Vertical integration means basically starting with raw materials, going through intermediate processing all the way to final to retail, wholesale and retail part of this. And they've been involved in this. In fact, they're getting more into retail now because I think they're kind of concerned about some of the issues that they've got, particularly in Africa, where a lot of the diamonds are in the world. And so it's been a very controversial firm. You might have seen there's a movie called Blood Diamond that came out a few years ago that talked about the fact that a lot of places in Africa have lots of mineral wealth, not just diamonds, but all kinds of mineral wealth, but not much else in terms of wealth. And the controversy stems from the fact that corporations who have nothing to do with Africa other than to extract their mineral wealth will pay their workers a pittance in order to retrieve those assets and then simply move them out. They don't have nothing to do with the local place at all. But a lot of people will be involved in trying to control those, trying to lease those mines to not just De Beers, but others. And so that's one notable example. I think that probably 100 years from now, maybe we won't be talking about them so much because I think they're trying to get out of that whole vertical integration bit. That is sort of a trend in the business world now, is to focus on one part of the chain rather than focusing on the whole thing, because it just becomes too difficult to manage for one thing. Other thing is that it becomes very much a target of government inquiry. Natural monopolies, utilities. We're going to talk more about those in a second before we move on to the next segment, which is natural monopoly, or the monopolistic competition. So we call utilities natural monopolies, and there's a reason why. And I'll get into the graphics on this before we end this chapter. Utilities almost everywhere are natural monopolies, and the reason for it is because it doesn't make any sense for any firm to compete against it. But we allow utilities to exist, and the reason we allow utilities to exist is because the fact that it doesn't make sense to have more than one power company, more than one water company, more than one gas company in a particular area. Now, this may change over time, but I don't think so, because if you were to allow, there's one practical matter, and I think I may have alluded to this before, and that is how many pipes and wires and power lines do we want to stretch across, the horizon and underground and all that. We've already got a lot of that going on now. And if we wanted 6 and 8 competitors for electric, would it even be beyond the fact that it's not, wouldn't we even want it? If we simply mandated this has to be the case, I think we'd find that would be more problematic than anything. I think we'd see everything being dug up and more power lines. I don't think we really want that. So we allow them to exist. And why do we allow monopolies to exist if they're so bad? Because we talked about what some of the issues are with monopolies. The reason we allow them to exist is so that we can regulate their activity, particularly in terms of price. Okay, and that's really the issue, is we essentially control the price of the product, and they have to get approval to raise the price. In the case of electricity, they call those rates because it's based upon kilowatt hour. They have to get approval, usually from the state authority, in order to do that. Okay. All right. Some other examples: purchasers, providers of certain government purchased output. Okay. So what is going on here? Well, this is interesting. And here, there doesn't seem to be a conflict at all, because it's primarily based upon things like very high-tech products or national defense products, where there's only one real buyer for Apache helicopters, and that's the U.S. government. And Boeing is the only producer because there's only one buyer. So if they win the contract to produce attack helicopters, then they get the product, then they get the contract, and they're really the only producer, and they become a monopolist in that particular area, simply because of the fact that they have not opened it to competing manufacturers. And the government's also got an interest here in not having that many people involved in understanding what these products are all about. There are only certain countries in the world that they do resale to. Yes, I know a lot of countries in the world have Apache helicopters and F-22s and all that, but they are resold from the U.S. government, and they do not buy directly from the manufacturer. Those are resold from the government. And we're starting to see this whole dynamic play out with the tanks in Ukraine, where Germany is reluctant to let some of those tanks loose because they're the ones who control it. It's a government control that and do it. And they are sort of, there's a lot of debate going on in Germany right now as to whether they want to be involved in the war in Ukraine, given the fact that Germany has got a long history of well, problematic military involvement, let's just put it nicely, in Europe, and particularly in Eastern Europe. And so, but you get the idea, they're really controlling those tanks, even though they don't make them, the government doesn't make them, but they're sort of controlling those, and the manufacturer in Germany cannot release those to Ukrainian government. Now, that may change. President Biden is working on that, but we'll see what happens. But that's the example of it. There's only one, if there's only one space shuttle, there's only one contractor needed to produce as being the main contractor, even though there may be thousands of subcontractors producing things like valves and, you know, fiberglass and all that, okay? And then the final one is the one that I think most of us are familiar with. That's any individual offering their unique output, what's called a winner-take-all market. Okay, I don't like that term winner-take-all, but it's used everywhere in economics. And saying what is better is winner-take-most, then maybe clarify it even further, winner-take-most for some period of time, right? Well, that's obviously a mouthful, and nobody likes that. So it's the idea that what it is anybody who's got some particular skill, whether it's artistic skill, whether it's musical talent, whatever. Obviously, right now, Taylor Swift is sort of the actor who's in this winner-take-all situation. Didn't she have like all 10 of the top 10 songs on the Billboard record charts not too long ago? Maybe she's still there. I don't know. I don't really follow Taylor Swift, but that's a pretty unusual situation. Just a dominant player in the market. And I know that in the 1980s, Michael Jackson was a similar position, and Elvis about 20 years or so before that. So there are people who command that. And in sports, there are some dominant players who basically dictate a lot of what their terms are, how they are going to, what kind of money they're going to accept, what kind of terms they're going to accept, et cetera. So anybody who offers a unique output in a winner-take-all market. There's a very famous story about Picasso, who somebody came into their shop and said, you draw a picture of my wife. And so he just sketched out in 10 minutes, he was done, and he charged him some exorbitant sum. And he said, well, it took you 10 minutes. And he said, no, it took me my whole life. So you're talking about somebody whose skills have been building up for a long time. And he didn't go to some any person on the street. He went to Picasso to have it done. So he was going to pay more. And so as a result, this is monopoly pricing power. We talk about market power. We're talking about on the supply side to set the price of the good. And if the buyer doesn't want to pay it, the buyer doesn't want to pay it. That's that. So you get the idea. It's this issue of market power through pricing, through control, essentially the distribution of the product. Okay? All right. So any questions about any of that?
Like insulin, I hear Eli Lilly is kind of a monopoly.
Yeah, I think there are other makers of insulin. It's an interesting story. And they sort of, and I wonder to what extent they got sort of led down this path that they didn't want to go down. So if you heard, it was last week, Lilly announced, Lilly's a big drug company based in Indianapolis. Somebody put something on Twitter saying that it was a fake, they spoofed their account or something, saying that Eli Lilly was going to lower the price of insulin, or I mean some exorbitant price decrease. And Lilly came out and said, no, that wasn't us. We decided not to do that. But then about 2 months later or so, now they come out and say, okay, we are going to do it. So I find that to be very, very weird that somebody impersonating Lilly on Twitter saying, impersonating their corporate account. And this was, by the way, not long after Elon Musk, who now owns Twitter, had said, we're going to verify who people are. We're going with a little blue dot or whatever it is, so that you can be sure that it's not some fake actor. And it turns out some fake actor faked Eli Lilly and offered it for less. And then Lilly decided ultimately to do that. But I think there are other producers. I don't really know if there are other producers as well, but them bringing that price down is probably a good thing. I suspect, however, they're not doing it because of that. I think the Twitter thing just sort of got the ball rolling, but I think the government is really on drug companies to lower prices because some of these drug prices are just outrageous. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. And I know, yes, the drug companies, they have a monopoly in the short run for the goods that they have, but insulin is certainly not a monopoly. It's certainly not a patented drug. There's nothing particularly complicated about insulin. In fact, I think what it is, I think they extract insulin from ground up pig pancreas is what they do. I think it's not to be gross or anything, but I think it's not very complicated. They just simply grind them up and they squeeze out and then obviously do refining. It's not as quite a grotesque of that, but I mean, it's not particularly complicated as to what the product is. That's where insulin comes from, basically. So I don't think they're a monopoly, but they probably had some market power at the time. But that's a strange situation. And we could do an entire semester on drug pricing because it's so difficult to understand what's going on. Yes, I know that drug companies will say, look, it cost us X million dollars to produce a drug and research it and test it and do all the paperwork, and paperwork stacks go from the ceiling to floor. I get all that, but still some of the prices are just absolutely unbelievable. And I mean, I've got an asthma condition, as you probably have observed. The drug that I take, I'm glad I have insurance because the drug I take is $750 for a 2-month supply. That's $9,000 a year for an asthma drug, and it's not a particularly complicated product. So I guess I'm lucky in that regard there, but you get the idea. There are some uncomplicated products. Of course, we ran into the same deal with Scully and the whole business about the what is it you inject if you've been bitten by a bee or whatever. EpiPen, yeah, the whole EpiPen scandal where EpiPens have been around forever. And he was raising the price of EpiPens because he was one of the few providers. And it was one of the few providers because not too many people want to be in the market because there aren't that many people who are allergic to and who are that susceptible to anaphylactic shock. Mostly due to bug bites. That's really the big issue. But and I know I did have a friend who was allergic, and he would always carry an EpiPen around. And I guess if you get bit by a bug, you put it in your leg or something. I don't know why you put it in your leg. That's where you have to do it. So anyway, beyond that though, any individuals, any supplier producing a product which is a winner take all product. Okay.
And like space travel, is that still going?
Well, as far as I know, and even there's competition, which is interesting because so you've got, and by the way, and I think New Mexico probably regretted funding the spaceport in Socorro, I think maybe, although people that are no longer in office in New Mexico, but because they thought, okay, this is going to be great. It's going to be the only, Richard Branson's, Virgin Galactic is going to be the only provider of recreational space travel. But then suddenly all these others pop up, like Jeff Bezos's firm and Elon Musk's firm, and there's one in Virginia, I think it started up. So that's not even a monopoly anymore. And so, I don't think that was probably a good investment on the state of New Mexico's part, frankly, because we don't hear much about it. And so to my knowledge, I don't think that space travel is really a monopoly anymore. It's very expensive because just of what it is you're buying. But yeah, so anyway.
Just don't hear anything about it.
You don't hear anything at all about it. I haven't heard anything about it. I watch the news pretty regularly. And I don't know how much money we put into producing this spaceport in Socorro, and which is basically an airport. That's what it is. Those are not inexpensive things to produce. And then as soon as we did that, we have these other competing firms, and we haven't heard very much from Branson, at least I haven't. So I don't even know where that stands at this point. But yeah, you're right. I think that whole business has sort of gotten some competition now. And how big that market will ever be, I don't know. I mean, it's going to be expensive, even 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. It's probably going to be expensive. But I don't know how many people really want to go into space. I mean, maybe there's more people than what I think. Maybe future generations will do more frequently than now. But I don't know. I think once we have the first crash, and I hate to say it, but once the first crash happens, I think it'll squeeze out the demand pretty quickly. Just like when air travel began, when planes started crashing, a lot of people got really scared to fly, and there are people today who still won't fly, even though it's safer than driving. So anyway, so what are the problems with monopolies? Well, these are economic problems. I'm going to get into some of what this looks like graphically before we get into the next market structure. So here are the main issues, okay? And we're going to talk a bit more about these. We haven't really gotten into this that much yet, but we'll come back to it. Higher prices than perfect competition, certainly. Lower outputs than perfect competition. That's almost the issue here. And then creation of a dead weight loss. And I'm going to talk about what that is. That's sort of a dead zone where no part of the economy gets value, not even the producer, but certainly not the demand side gets the value from that. It's basically a zone of it's a no-go zone because it's primarily formed by two things: the reduction in output and the higher price, and also reduction in consumer surplus. And remember what the definition of consumer surplus was, and that was this idea that there are some part of the demand side that are willing to pay more for the product than what the price is, because the price is market determined typically. And therefore, if it's cheaper to buy a good than to make it, then you would have consumer surplus because it would cost you a lot to, make something like your own diet soda in your backyard or whatever. And so we instead buy it, so we get consumer surplus. Also possible lower quality of output. That's not so much a given, and that one I put that last on the list because there are cases in which people have complained about the fact that sometimes the output is qualitatively not as superior in monopolies, that monopolies don't have the incentive to, don't have the incentive to provide quality output, and that's a criticism. That's by no means not a universal criticism. I'm trying to adjust the camera here because I hit a button and the thing just went haywire. So, okay, so, all right. So let's talk about some of these things here. And in particular, I want to talk about how monopolies form prices of their products, okay? So again, I'm going to come back to this idea. I want to focus on perfect competition first of all, and then talk about how it differs. Remember, with perfect competition, we have a split screen view. We have the market on a PQ plane. We have the individual firm on another PQ plane here. And we simply have the intersection of demand and supply that forms the market price. Very simple. And so we have a downward sloping demand curve. And I realize that we've already gotten to the section of the class where we talked about some demand curves being steep or flat, whatever. That doesn't really impact us because we're mostly interested in getting to the equilibrium price. And so the equilibrium price is formed at whatever the equilibrium price is formed in the marketplace under perfect competition. But this is perfect competition we're talking about. So as a result, the firm takes the price that's given. And as a result, that price is essentially also the marginal revenue curve, which is also in this case the demand curve. Okay. And if something happens where, let's say, there's an increase in suppliers, so S goes from S0 to S1, for instance, and that tends to bring down the market price. And so as a result, we go from P0 to P1. And as a result, the firm has no choice but to take the price. And so now we go from P0 to P1 into a new D1 and MR1, MR being marginal revenue. The firm, those should be vertical, they're not very straight, are they? No, you get the idea. They're horizontal. So the firm is the price taker. Yeah, nothing could be further from the case with monopoly. Nothing could be further from the truth on the monopoly, which is quite different. You don't have to worry about a supply shift in either direction, left or right for that matter, with the case of monopoly. So let's talk about the monopoly firm here, the monopoly structure, and what that looks like. So this is perfect competition up here, right? And so we'll just sort of separate that. Then let's talk about monopoly. So monopoly, remember, there is no split screen because the firm is the industry, essentially. So we've got a demand curve that's downward sloping like that. And we've got a supply curve, which is upward sloping like that, right? Okay, but here's the difference. Here, demand and marginal revenue are the same. Here, there's a difference, and it's because of what's called the negative price effect, where marginal revenue lies to the left of and is steeper than the demand curve, okay? That's an important thing for us to remember. And remember, we talked on Wednesday of last week about what the reasons were for that. And we said that there are two things going on with revenue. Because what is revenue? Revenue is simply the price of the good times the quantity of the good. Always, always, always. Price times quantity equals revenue. But price and quantity go in opposite directions, right? With demand side. So the price goes up, the quantity demand goes down, the price goes down, the quantity demand goes up. So the question is, where the push-pull is? Which part of this wins the arm wrestle? Is it price or is it quantity? And we're saying it's price. That the negative price effect means the price effect outweighs the output effect. So yes, revenue would come up theoretically as you produce more output, but it also comes down as you produce more output. Because why? Because the price of the good has to fall to price in more buyers. If you want to price in more buyers, and in the case of imperfect competition, you would want to do that. So here's the thing, okay? And here's where things are different between perfect competition and monopoly, okay? In perfect competition, we have the market price is the intersection of demand and supply, okay? So as a result, you would end up with, the quantity would be here. The competitive quantity, we'll call it Q sub C, is there. It's the intersection of demand and supply. No problem there at all, right? And then the market price is also the intersection of demand and supply. All you're doing is simply dragging over to the coordinates from that particular point. And that's where a competitive firm will have its market equilibrium for however long that equilibrium exists. And remember, the equilibrium is simply a condition of short-term stability in the market for however long it lasts. You got to take a picture of it because it's not going to be the same going forward. But here's the thing about monopoly. Monopoly is going to want to do this. Remember that the profit maximizing firm in all industries, the profit maximizing quantity in all industries is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And I know we're going to keep harping on that again and again and again. Something to keep in mind. The profit maximizing quantity, the pi symbol simply means profit, maximum profit, and the output level that reaches maximum profit is where marginal revenue is marginal cost. Well, it's the same case here. Price, the profit maximizing firm is simply going to want to produce where they're going to, first of all, the marginal revenue is going to be given. They can't do anything about it. And in the case of perfect competition, it'll simply be supply and marginal cost are one and the same. And so there's no conflict there. They'll simply produce that level there, right? Whatever that is. That becomes the equilibrium quantity. Okay, well, here's the same thing happens essentially with monopoly. The firm will produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And again, supply is the same as marginal cost. Marginal revenue is the one that's different between perfect competition and monopoly, but not marginal cost. So what does the firm do? It'll find out where its marginal revenue is its marginal cost. It'll produce that output level and it will mark up its price, whatever the demand side is willing to pay at that particular price. And so as a result, you have what? You have a higher amount of price and a lower amount of quantity. And those are the first two issues on that PowerPoint slide. Was higher prices than perfect competition and lower output levels. And essentially how the firm does it, they control the price by controlling the output. That's essentially how the price is maintained. There's no point in giving your product away if you're a monopoly. In fact, if you've got a monopoly in certain areas, you probably don't want to make it available to everybody. You only want to make it available to those who are willing to pay the price, because the more output you produce, the price comes down. So early monopolists really have no desire to extend their product to everybody. We obviously control the quantity and the price of natural monopolies, but in the case of a firm that's first in the market as a monopoly, they don't make it all available to everybody because it brings the price down if it's no longer that scarce. We come back to this idea of scarcity value again and again. Okay, and then we have the creation of a dead weight loss. Well, what is that? Okay, it's essentially this region here, where there's no output being produced and there's no economic value being. It's sort of a dead zone. So that's sort of that triangle there is essentially what we call the dead weight loss. There's no value there. Because there's no value, mostly in terms of quantity going to the demand side, but there's also no revenue being earned by anybody in this particular case. This is just simply a dead weight loss. It's a dead zone because there's no production out here. We lose that production capability, and whatever economic value that would have gone to consumers is essentially taken away. Now, remember, with consumer surplus, the thing about consumer surplus that's important to know, and I'll have to swivel the screen over here again, is what is consumer surplus all about? I know that we covered this, but it's been a bit of time. It's been a minute or two. So let's talk again about what consumer surplus is. If you want to revisit this in earlier chapters, you may benefit from doing that. But think about what consumer surplus basically is. So it's essentially this: you've got a demand for a good here, and you've got a supply for a good here, and you've got some equilibrium. Here we go. And you've got some equilibrium price here. But what did we say about this? We said that, and this is an example of any kind of a market, really, supply and demand. So you've got a price here, but let's say the price is 14 for whatever the good is. It doesn't matter what the good is. But there are people willing to pay 15 and 18 and 20 and whatever. And so essentially what's going on with monopolies is, at least from what they're trying to do, is keep the price high. And so they're basically trying to usurp and take away some of their consumer surplus. So what would have been the entire range here is less because the price is higher. So in other words, they're taking away consumer surplus. Consumer surplus being the value that accrues to the demand side, because there are people willing and able to pay a price higher than the equilibrium price, but it's usurped by the supply side. So this is some of the problems with monopolies. These main issues, and really these first three are probably the biggest of all. Higher prices, lower outputs, dead weight loss, but also this idea of consumer surplus, and the loss of which is an important thing for us to be cognizant of. Okay. All right, so questions about that?
Wouldn't it affect like labor wages? I mean, if you're at Charles Dickens times and everything's a monopoly, like you're probably not gonna get paid very well.
No, you're probably not gonna get paid much because, and it kind of goes back to this idea of monopsony buyers. If you've got a monopoly, and let's say you're in an area where you dominate the labor force, just like on the screen above here, we're talking about monopsony buyer. Well, there are what we call monopsony labor markets, where there's one big employer in a particular area. And I know you think of London as not being especially a limited area, but you've got one big employer and they set the wage. So that they become a monopsony buyer, which is a form of monopoly power, because they're essentially buying labor. Remember that the actors do a different thing. So not only are sellers firms in the economic flow, not only are they producers, but they're also employers. And so if you can set the wages, you can set them where you want. You're going to set them lower than what would probably be the market average, simply because of the fact that you can. And if you could do it, why not do it? And by the way, this is done, and it's not even just the case of monopoly or single providers. I know that I worked in a market in banking, and we found this out years after I had started, and I found this out probably through an inadvertent admission by a former HR director. We had an HR director of the bank I worked. We had 3 major banks in the city which I first started working in Indianapolis, and they apparently would get together, and I heard this years after the guy retired. Our HR director retired. They would get together about the HR directors and talk about wages and try to set the wages a little bit lower than what they would have been otherwise. And they tried to set them across the board. And to me, I don't know if that's illegal or not. Probably not. But we wonder when we got bought by a bigger bank, and then eventually we got bought by JP Morgan, that our wages went up dramatically because of the fact that we had to fall in line with their particular scale, which was set higher. And so that, it is the case that sellers or buyers of labor, i.e. employers, can set wages. And it doesn't even have to be a monopoly case where that buyer does it. This was collusion on the labor front, which I don't know if it's illegal or not. It sounds like it should be maybe, but it may not be. So yeah, like in Charles Dickens times, no question about it. If you didn't want the job, somebody else get out of line because somebody else will take it. So yeah, no question about that. Okay. All right. Let's see here. I'm gonna make sure the camera is set to. Okay, so I want to do one final thing here before we move on to chapter 9 or chapter 10. And that is this. I want to talk a bit about natural monopolies and what's going on. I'm going to put a dollar figure on this axis here. So remember, when we talked about economies of scale, we're talking about a long run average total cost curve, which simply looks something like that, right? And we said that this entire region here is one where we have economies of scale. That is, as you produce more output over time, you should be able to lower the price of your product. And you've got something here that we call minimum efficient scale, right there, minimum efficient scale. You get the minimum cost. And then this area here is what we call diseconomies of scale, which we said was a little bit less common, simply because of the fact that if a firm gets to the point where it costs them too much, then competition is probably going to either force them to lower their costs, get out of the market, they exit the market, or the firm will decide on its own it wants to divest whatever units it needs to. As General Motors began to do, we talked about General Motors as being sort of the case in point, almost the perfect exemplar of a firm experiencing diseconomies of scale for many decades. And they even started to recognize it. So even while they were creating new business units like Saturn and what was the other thing? Saturn was one business unit. I think Hummer, Geo, was that a separate product as well? A separate line. They were getting rid of other lines like Pontiac and Oldsmobile, and in order to try to get sort of right sized. And Pontiacs weren't that much different than Buicks, and Oldsmobiles weren't that much different than Buicks either. So there's a lot of duplication, which is a lot of what economies of scale are. Okay, but here we're talking about economies of scale. This is a very long run condition. We're calling this the long run average total cost curve. Knowing, of course, that even within this, we've got different combinations of short run aggregate supply curves that look like that. So, and we talked a bit about how that works. But here's the thing with utilities. So utilities are in a case where you've got a fairly steep demand curve, right? So the demand for the product is here, right? And we're going to say this is of one firm. So we're going to simply call it one firm. One firm supplying the market, okay? And they supply it at an average cost of ATC1. Okay? So they supply to one ATC one. So this is P&M, this is Albuquerque Berlin Water Authority, which is that's in this market, it's mostly public, but in some markets it's private when it's a private water company. Natural gas, New Mexico Gas, another example. Those used to be the same. New Mexico P&M split off their gas operations years ago. They used to be all under P&M, but they got rid of that. So, but those are examples of monopolies. What if a competing firm came in and now we have not one firm, we have two firms now. So here's the problem, and this is a market demand curve. What they do is they end up splitting the market. That's one of the best case scenarios, splitting the market. But by so doing, they drive up the cost for everybody. And so the economics of this don't make sense. The economics of it don't make sense. The same market demand is here, but yet you've now got to cut in half because there are two firms. And we're saying they theoretically provide 50% of the market to each other. This is possible if only you could enter the market, but it doesn't make sense to do it. And so we say this is a natural monopoly. The reason the term natural comes up is because it doesn't make sense for any other producer to come into the market. Because not beyond just the practical issues of how many pipes you want to have running across the underground and across the landscape, and how many wires, if you're talking about electricity and power lines and transformers and substations. And that's a lot of infrastructure. It's a lot of cost. And it's just extremely difficult to get into. And so that's an entry barrier. And so because there's an entry barrier to utilities, it doesn't really make sense. And so because of that, we have to regulate them because we tolerate them, but we tolerate them through regulation. That's really the key thing here, is we tolerate these firms through regulation, okay? And that's really the thing to know is about monopolies, about what we call natural monopolies. And so P&M wants a price increase. They've got to go to the Public Regulation Commission in Santa Fe, and it was in New Mexico, in order to get a rate increase. And they are not particularly shy about doing it, at least from my observation, that they seem not to have too much difficulty wanting to do it. And there are all kinds of different means by which we can regulate the actual price. One thing we don't have on here is the price of the good, because all we're talking about here is simply demand for the product, the cost of the product, the price has got to be somewhere higher than the cost. So you can imagine that if the cost is higher, then obviously the price paid by consumers will definitely be higher. Consumers and businesses, any kind of user of electricity, the price is going to go up. Nobody wants that. So nobody wants to see that happen. So when we talk about the idea that bigger is better, sometimes it actually is, especially for the demand side, because if you have more competitors and you allow those competitors to exist, first of all, this would be difficult to get into and drive up. But if it did happen, it would raise the price. So if we were to insist on competition just for competition's sake, then we'd end up paying higher prices. And so that's one of the difficult things. So we tolerate the monopoly structure, even with all the issues we talked about a second ago, the higher prices. Well, we control the prices, and we mandate a higher output. We mandate that everyone they deliver output. And in the wintertime, we mandate that they don't turn people's electricity off in January and February, at least in some places. I think certainly here it becomes a public relations issue. People, are freezing to death or whatever in January, February. So, okay, so we control output, we control price, and those are really the main issues there with that. So, all right. So, any questions about natural monopoly and what that is all about? Okay. Well, I think that basically does it for the discussion of the second market structure, and that is monopoly. So, what we want to do is this. I want to sort of circle back to what we talked about before. We have 4 market structures that we're studying in this class. Perfect competition, and then 3 are to be categorized jointly as imperfect competition. We categorize them jointly mostly because of this issue concerning marginal revenue. So it's a marginal revenue issue that's different. So I think you want to know that. You want to write that down at least. Marginal revenue is what differentiates, among other things, perfect competition from imperfect competition. Imperfect competition is opposed to monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. Okay. All right. So let's talk about monopolistic competition. It's the third structure, and it's the one that I said at the outset of the class, or the outset of this particular segment of the class, that it seems like it's a bit of a oxymoron. It's a paradox, or whatever the word I want is there. And that is, how do you, if we present perfect competition and monopoly as being 2 ends of the same thing, or flip sides of the other, North Pole, South Pole, they couldn't be much different, then how do you have a hybrid of both of those, which is what monopolistic competition is? it seems like it's oxymoronic. So let's talk about why that's the case. And we could justify it because really it's a time frame issue, okay? Monopolies, as long as you can maintain a monopoly, the norm is to earn profits, and not just accounting profits, but also economic profits, which are lower than accounting profits, but are more difficult to achieve. As long as you can maintain the monopoly, that's really the issue. And that's why, as we get into the following chapter, we'll talk about this idea of maintaining monopoly and why it's problematic legally, and what the implications are if we try to allow a monopoly to remain in place. Okay, but in the short run, some firms can have what we call monopolistic competition. And that is, it's a hybrid of both. And what does that mean? A hybrid of both perfect competition, monopoly. Look up the other time frame, and let's talk about that. So what are some of the characteristics of monopolistic competition? I know you haven't got these slides yet. I'll be putting those up. I have to do some sort of working around and moving some slides around, simply because of the fact that we're on a different schedule than last time I used these slides. So hopefully I can get everything updated here shortly in this course, but you'll have those. So what are some of the characteristics? Okay, some of these are going to look like competition. Some of these are going to look like monopoly. Many sellers exist in the market. So here we're talking about lots and lots of sellers. Maybe not the thousands that we might run into with perfect competition. By the way, I was reading a paper the other day about the egg market. I know we've been hearing about eggs endlessly lately. And the fact is that people are saying, well, it's because the big firms that control the distribution of eggs, they're withholding these products. And that's not really the case, because there's some 19,993 producers of eggs in the country, and there's really no way for them to get together and say, okay, let's control the egg market. The avian flu really has taken a toll. Plus, demand is rising for it because it's a less expensive protein source. There are lots of meats today, which obviously, if you've been looking at meat prices, they're very high relative to where they have been. So, the egg market is sort of a double whammy. So when we talk about perfect competition, we're talking about something like the egg market, which just now temporarily has a price hike, but it almost serves as justification for some of the things we've been talking about already in this class, that if there's economic profit, it's short term, the long-term condition will be zero economic profit. We will see the price of eggs come down at some point. I can guarantee you that. There's just no way that the price of eggs is going to stay at $4 or $5 per dozen. Once the supply issue works its way out, I think you'll see it. Now, I don't know that it'll go back to $1.89, but it will go down. This is temporary, and there are lots and lots of producers of eggs. And in fact, now we're starting to see imports of eggs. Some of them actually illegal imports. We're seeing some illegal import of eggs from Mexico just to hit the market, because it makes sense now to bring in eggs. If you get caught with a truckload of eggs, it's a lot different than being caught with a truckload of cocaine, right? So obviously the markup is different. These are different kinds of things, but money is money at the end of the day, even though it's not quite as big a money. There is an economic incentive to smuggle products. And so as a result, we will see the price of eggs go down. So maybe not thousands, but yet we've got many in the market. And so there are competing issues. And by the way, it comes really back to this issue of brand. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Relative ease of entry and exit. So low entry barriers. So right now it sounds a lot like perfect competition. Until we get to this point, this is a big issue here, which is why its underlying products are very similar, but they're highly differentiated. So these are products that the demand side at least perceives that there's a difference in the particular product. And differentiation is simply the idea, and it's sort of a marketing term that says, how do we make our product different? It's better, it's more efficient, it saves money, it does these things, it lasts longer, it's better quality, it looks better, whatever. Whatever these qualities that marketers are looking to instill in the minds of buyers are really how you differentiate the product. And so as a result, one brand of detergent might be pretty similar to another brand. They might do the very same thing. They might cause different prices because there's a different view of the product for whatever reason. And marketers are well aware of this. If you go on and take a marketing course, you probably will come across this idea of brand management and how some of these brands, by the way, are managed by the same company. So Procter & Gamble, which is about a 170-year-old company, has been selling detergent forever, and they control not just the Tide, which is the premier brand. And in fact, I was in Walmart the other day and they had the Tide locked up behind glass. It's like, what on earth is going on there? You know, it's such an expensive product. But I think Sheer is also one of the products. I think All is another product. And they go down the market. They go down market for whatever reason because the other brands are not really supported by advertising the way Tide is. I think Tide is probably about the only one of their product array that they promote through advertising. So advertising is simply this idea of brand management. And brand management is this idea of trying to have a product look different, be better qualitatively than some other kind of product. Whether it is or not is mostly irrelevant. I mean, I think that ideally it'd be a twofer if you get a product that is perceived to be better and actually is better, but does. And by the way, this idea of branding is really the effort. It's a marketing effort to make sure that the product is supported by all these kinds of things. Brand management is an important aspect of maintaining this differentiation. So much so that a lot of the goods we buy are heavily branded goods, right? In fact, you could say, well, isn't everything we buy heavily branded? Well, not really. Not everything we buy really is heavily branded. And even some of the goods that have brands are very, very weak brands. Okay. So like my wife texted me a shopping list the other day. So I went to the store. She wanted some sugar. And so I noticed there was a very highly branded sugar. I think it was G&H. It cost like $5 or $6 for a little carton. And then there was one that was sort of a generic, I think it was generic Albertsons. That was like half the price, and I bought the generic. Because sugar is sugar, right? But some people latch on to brands, and to the extent that people will do that, they'll buy. Now, I have no idea why somebody would buy a branded sugar, because I'm telling you, sugar is sugar, and it is what it is. So whatever these goods are, whether if you now sometimes people don't care for price differences as much. Morton salt probably is not that much more expensive than the branded salt, although I don't really know for sure. But you get the idea that it's about price, and it's the ability to get a higher price through the branding. And branding is an interesting activity. And the thing about it is firms will go out of the way to support their brand. They'll absolutely go out of the way in order to protect what they've got going on. And this is why if you go to a restaurant, you order a Coke, and they don't carry Coke, they will always say what to you? Always, always, always. You order a Coke and they don't sell Coke, they'll say what? Is Pepsi okay? And the reason why is because Coca-Cola actually sends people out in the field to make sure that Pepsi sellers of Pepsi who only have Pepsi products don't represent Pepsi as Coke, because they don't want their brand to be confused with another brand. They want Coke to be a particular brand and Pepsi to be a particular brand. And by the way, those two brands have been going at it for decades. In fact, there was very famous cola wars back in the 80s where they were just beating each other's brains out, which essentially ended, it was like 70s days, which ended with Coke deciding to come out with new Coke. And it's been about 40 years. I think probably a lot of people here probably don't remember that, but I do. And I remember when Coca-Cola came out with new Coke, and they said, okay, the Coke that you know is gone, it's better, because they did all this research saying that people liked a little bit of a sweeter soft drink. Pepsi is considered to be a little sweeter. They're wondering why they were losing market share to Pepsi. It's because they thought, well, it must be because people like the sweeter taste. In taste tests, people liked the sweeter. When they were given 2 Dixie cups that they didn't know what they were drinking, they always liked it sweeter, so they came out with it. Well, this is one of it just has filled academic journals, business journals with academic literature on the mistake that Coca-Cola made because they messed with one of the strongest brands in the world. If not the strongest brand in the world for a very long time. It's been around for decades. Your great-grandparents were familiar with Coca-Cola. It's been around that long, and so they were messing with the brand, even though they shouldn't have. And I can remember that people would actually literally go to grocery stores and walk out with cases and cases of Coke before the new Coke hit the stands. People were protesting in front of Coca-Cola headquarters. That's how important brand is to people. Brand is a really valuable thing to people. They were going nuts over this. And then Coca-Cola realized, oh, we messed up badly. And they decided to bring out Coke, the original formula they called Coke Classic for years and years and years, Coke Classic. And then they finally retired the old Coke very quietly. And now they have since taken away the name Classic from Coca-Cola, as if the whole thing never happened in the first place. But it took years and years and years to unwind. And as a result, there was no purpose behind it in the first place. By the way, I know that everybody thinks that they can tell the difference between brands, and yet study after study have proven that people cannot tell the difference between brands. And if I gave you a Dixie cup of Coke and a Dixie cup of Pepsi, I bet you all think, oh, I can tell the difference, but in reality, you really cannot. And we did a study when I was in graduate school of this very idea of brands, in fact, and we got in a little bit of trouble because we had alcohol on a college campus, but it was for academic purposes, I assure you. We had Dixie cups of Bud Light and Miller Lite. Now, I know a lot of beer drinkers think they can always tell the difference that Bud Light and Miller Lite have nothing in common whatsoever. And but instead, people, I think it was about 51% success rate, which is about half, which is basically flipping a coin that people cannot tell the difference between Bud Light and Miller Lite. And yet these brands, people think these are entirely different products altogether. And a lot of it's because of the fact that you're drinking a Bud Light. You know you're drinking Bud Light, so it's reinforced the idea it's Bud Light. There's no confusion on your mind. Hey, this Bud Light tastes like a Miller Lite. Nobody ever says that kind of thing. So as a result, this is how important branding is to our psychology. And as a result, firms will go to great lengths to protect the brand. They will have, not just the sending people out in the field to go to restaurants that sell Pepsi to make sure they're not representing as Coke, but then all kinds of things. There are lawyers that protect brands and make sure that people aren't trying to steal the brand, they're not trying to steal the trademark. Again, these are intellectual properties. These are ways to prop up the price, to get monopolistic pricing power to some extent. Maybe not the full market price markup, but at least some markup over perfect competition, which is synonymous with unbranded, undifferentiated goods, commoditized goods that are undifferentiable one from the other. Potatoes are potatoes, green beans are green beans. Nobody says that about cola products for the most part, that it's all the same. And so as a result, pricing power is in direct correlation. The stronger the brand, the higher the price will be, because what is trying to happen is the firm is trying to do this. They're trying to steepen the demand curve, trying to make the demand curve more inelastic as to price. And by doing that, they can have some pricing power. And by the way, there's been a lot of talk about this inflation going on in the economy right now. And there is some support for the idea that firms are really milking this inflation story for all they're worth, because they're raising the price of products way higher than the cost of production. In fact, inflation is raging because one accusation is, and I think there's some support for it, that the fact that these margins are expanding. That is the difference between price and average total cost. That is, output value and input value is widening, and firms are really taking advantage of it, particularly with their brand name goods. They're charging more and more and more all the time, and they know they're doing it. And in fact, I saw an article over the weekend. Speaking of Bud Light, I'm not really that familiar with the beer market that much, but InBev, which is the parent company of Budweiser, was talking about the fact that they were trying to raise the price of the product. And in some markets it would stick, in some areas not so much. And they found people were buying less quantity with the higher prices. And so what they're trying to do is trying to promote the value of the product, because we know that the beer companies do lots and lots of advertising. And why not? The price of beer is here and the cost to produce is here. Beer is not a particularly complicated product at all. But promoting the brand and keeping the brand strong is what it's all about. There was a very famous story a few years ago where there was something wrong with a particular batch of beer. I think it was Budweiser or whatever. And they ended up pouring the entire production run down the drain. They just got rid of it because they didn't want to have this, whatever slight imperfection that this particular production run had witnessed, they didn't want to release on the market. Even though it wasn't going to hurt anybody, maybe 1% of the population would have noticed it, probably not too much at all. That's how important the brand is to the firm, because it's everything. It's what props the price up, and that's what generates the profits, and what generates the whole ability to provide employment and keep the product going for year after year. Okay. So anyway, much more on this on Wednesday when we come back, and we'll talk about this. We'll also get into oligopoly, and I don't know if we're going to get into the bit about antitrust this week, but if not, we've certainly got plenty of time to cover that. So any questions for me about anything that I've talked about so far? Okay, have a great rest of your day. See you on Wednesday.